Is lockdown almost finally over? Well, the government seems insistent that domestic vaccine passports, where you have to show that you've had the COVID jab to go to the pub, the theatre, a cinema, is the solution. Is this the biggest change to our democratic rights we've ever seen? Well, church leaders certainly think so, saying it's unethical, that it constitutes one of the most dangerous policy proposals ever made. So does it unify us or divide us? Is it the thin end of the wedge? Are you happy to show your vaccine ID card to have a pint in your local boozer? Or is Big Brother coming for you? This is Tice Talk. Hello. So if I told you in January last year that life as we knew it was about to come to an abrupt, dramatic end, that draconian laws were about to be rushed through Parliament, the country would be subjected to crippling lockdowns, you'd have thought me, quite rightly, mad. But on March the 23rd last year, the Prime Minister announced the first of what would be, so far, 3 national lockdowns. The first lasted nearly 4 months until July. Then we had tears, and then the second lockdown in November, despite the Prime Minister vowing to do everything in his power to avoid these measures. There were light restrictions or tight restrictions over Christmas because we were promised freedom by Easter after the vulnerable and the elderly had been vaccinated by mid to late February. Doesn't seem to have happened, does it? And then a third national lockdown started at the beginning of January and is only just being eased now, long after Easter is a distant memory. So is the end finally in sight? But why have vaccine passports risen to the top of the agenda despite the Prime Minister and senior cabinet members repeatedly saying, no, this is not the British way? And are we heading for a 4th national lockdown? These are the million-dollar questions, and to help me answer is, of course, the million-dollar man.
Well, I knew you were going to go there.
Couldn't resist it, could I?
Very good to see you, Richard.
Nice to see you,
it's actually lovely to be back because, as you know, we've been traversing the length and breadth of the country.
We have indeed. I've been in Hartlepool campaigning, and, you know, it was fantastic talking to people on the doorstep. What is absolutely clear is people are sick and tired of lockdowns.
Yep.
They've had enough. You know, they want their lives back to normal.
Can I show you some photos? So first of all, let me show you me campaigning yesterday in Dagenham, because for a start, the sun came out, and here we are. Look at that. Look at that. Very joyous bunch.
Fantastic.
And what I was going to say was that actually, for me, there was very mixed response on the doorstep. There are those people who are so desperate to get out of this ridiculous authoritarian draconian lockdown, and those who are so frightened and worried senseless that actually they're wearing masks outside. That you know, they really have bought into that culture of fear. Is that what you found
in East London the other day? I was quite shocked actually on the high street. 50% of people wearing masks, and you know, really still quite anxious, and not helped, of course, by the NHS and the government now handing out boxes and boxes of free tests, even though you're perfectly healthy. Seems extraordinary. But I was heartened in Hartlepool, you know, how frustrated people were. They want their lives back to normal. There we are, getting ready to campaign. You know, I think there's a lot of irritation, frustration out there, and we wonder when's this all going to end.
Well, let me just talk you through the way that we think we're going to get out of the current lockdown. Now, just to remind you, on the 17th of May, allegedly pubs reopen indoors, and then obviously theatres and sports, but they're meant to be socially distanced. Now, whether that's possible remains to be seen. And then the date that we're all looking forward to, the 21st of June, and that is when lockdown is meant to end. But I really don't believe it, because I just feel that the government is now making some very strange, worrying overtures, don't you?
Well, I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? The Prime Minister suddenly saying last week that, in fact, it's not the vaccination programme that's the result of infection that has caused infections and deaths to fall. No, it was the lockdown, as though that's sort of softening us up for further lockdowns in months to come. Why has he done that?
Yeah, well, I think that's partly it. I think it's also trying to keep the public constrained, but also medically, what worries me is despite the fact we've had this incredible vaccine rollout where we've had over 30 million people having their first dose, nearly 10 million people having their second dose, they're now seeding doubt, aren't they? They're talking about the South African variant, saying the vaccines may well not cover that, the extension of the test and trace app, and they're then talking about possibility of a third vaccine. And I'd have to tell you that this whole sort of shift in agenda we called out last week, and there's a tweet that we actually sent out last week.
We've called it out, and others have too. I mean, Dawn Butler, extraordinarily, she was calling the Prime Minister, a creeping dictator.
She was indeed.
You know,
in fact, yeah, she was indeed. And there's Dawn's article in the Metro. And I think, Dawn and I don't always agree on everything. But actually, I think she's right. She said that they've introduced very draconian powers. Parliament wasn't even sitting. There was no vote on it.
Yep.
And it gets worse than that, because it's not only politicians and all of these crossbenchers who are worried. The Church is worried, not just the Church of England, but we've now seen 1,200 church leaders saying, hang on a minute, this is totally unethical.
Using pretty strong language, they described it as discriminatory, divisive and destructive. I mean, when the Church come out with that sort of language, surely politicians need to just step back and say, hang on, is that the right thing to do?
Yeah, not only the Church, you've got Liberty, the campaigning organisation, actually saying this is a fundamental fragmentation of rights, that it marginalises those people who are already vulnerable, and actually they're deeply worried about what this says about where we're going. And quite frankly, you've got the government pushing things through that most of these bodies say, hang on a minute, we need to look at this, we need to really think through the ramifications. And as you and I know, Reform UK stands very strongly by saying no vaccine passports.
Absolutely. Well, we're committing to no more lockdowns and no vaccine passports. Well, we've got some great chats to come. Thank you very much for that, David. Well, firstly, to talk about the threat of a fourth national lockdown, we're going to talk to a well-known journalist, commentator, who is extremely worried about the real possibility of another national lockdown. And she stuck her head above the parapet to warn people that it's coming. Beverley Turner is a journalist, a radio host, author of 3 books and a very busy mum of 3 kids. And she joins us now. Beverley, fantastic to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time. Great to see you. Now, you made it very clear you haven't held back. You tweeted just last week, not holding back. The government has also the next lockdown planned for October. Regardless of numbers, if that doesn't tell you everything, nothing will. Every journalist who interviews any minister should be asking about this now. So you've obviously got some inside intel, Beverley. What makes you so sure?
Well, I couldn't possibly reveal my sources, but I think it's fairly well known from amongst anybody that has any roots into Westminster that plans are being put in place at the moment to enact an autumn lockdown. Now, we all hope this isn't going to happen, and I'm sure there are some people in government who hope that this isn't going to happen. But as you just said earlier, the government are making some quite worrying noises now, attributing the reduction in infection and the huge reduction in serious illness and death, not to a vaccine passport or to the fact that the weather is getting warmer and viruses have seasonal changes, but entirely to lockdowns. And when Boris Johnson says anything like that, we have to very carefully pause, take a step back and work out where this is going to lead next. Because what the last 12 months has taught us, if nothing else, is that they sow the seeds by stealth and by very clever manipulation of the public, so that when eventually changes are announced, we are primed to accept them. And that is what's happened repeatedly over the last 12 months. And that's what worries me enormously. As you say, we are now in a position where the vaccine rollout for the most vulnerable has been incredibly successful. And yet we are seeing events like the Queen's funeral, at the Prince Philip's funeral at the weekend, where the Queen was sat masked and alone. And it is a dehumanizing of normal interactions, which is breaking my heart, and we are sick of it. The vast majority of the public have been patient. They have been compliant. We have accepted and acceded to a lot of the requests, and now we are having to ask serious questions. And it is absolutely, it is vital for all of us to be doing that. It is understandable why we feel like this, because we've had 12 months of brainwashing, but we all have to now stop and go, hang on a minute, where am I going to get my information from? How can I see the other side of what's going on? And what precisely are we moving towards?
But one of the real issues, and we've been campaigning and we hear this, you've got half the population that's furious, and we might be in that category. You've then got the other half of the population that actually are terrified, scared witless. And, you know, we hear it and see it on the streets campaigning. And, you know, that's a lack of confidence. How are we going to get that confidence back? And is that what the government is preying on?
There's another section of society that I think it falls sometimes into both of those categories, but there's a third which is worried about what other people think.
Yeah.
And when we are in a supermarket, if we are wearing a mask, a lot of people are now doing so because they are not because they think they're going to die of coronavirus. They've looked at the statistics and they know that there is a 99.8% survival rate with this infection. They look at their own personal profile. Are they suffering from comorbidities? Are they overweight? Are they young? They know they're not going to get seriously ill from SARS-CoV-2. What they are worried about is what other people think when they see them in the supermarket without a mask. That, I think, is our primary hurdle that we have to get over at the moment, is social judgment.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Bev. And you and I have both worked in newsrooms. I know you're asking the questions. I was speaking to another journalist at the BBC, and it has been made very, very clear to me that when you ask the BBC awkward questions about should we be investigating this, shouldn't we be questioning the government on their change in rhetoric, they have been told to be quiet. They have been told, no, this is what we are doing. This is the editorial stance. Does that worry you?
Enormously. It means we live in China, because what we've seen from this gradual creeping of this totalitarian authoritarianism that we're now living under is that there is one side of this narrative, and it is a joy for me to sit here and take part in this debate and to hear what you guys are saying. And I would applaud anybody that wants to look for the different narrative, because the mainstream media, and I am part of that, and I have never been as disappointed with what I see on our channels as I've been in the last year. And, you know, we take part, David, in some of the same debate shows, and it's quite interesting to see the people who get booked day after day and those of us who pop up from time to time, because perhaps we're talking an unpalatable truth that people don't want to hear. And I don't know what the main reason for that is.
Well,
I mean, what?
Well,
sorry,
if I give you an example of not being able to discuss, 3 times when I wanted to talk about the Great Barrington Declaration, twice on the BBC and once on Sky, I was literally cut off the moment I mentioned the words, no, we're not going to talk about that, we can't talk about that. And that's a serious alternative. And this is, you know, our freedom of speech is being completely eroded.
Freedom of speech, freedom of bodily autonomy. If we're talking about vaccine passports, that's going to be about a coercion for people who don't want to have the vaccine to take part in what is officially a clinical trial in order to live a normal day-to-day existence. Now, how has that happened? That's the stuff that is, I don't know. I don't know why the debate is not being had on both sides. We do live in a world, of course, with an ad-based revenue media model. So I understand why those channels which are paid for by adverts have kept this drama going, because drama is very watchable, and there are shows that have had record viewing figures because fear is a driver for people to consume the media. And that's what has happened.
It seems extraordinary to me. There's a very good article in The Spectator today from an eminent scientist saying that we've already reached herd immunity. The rollout of the vaccine has been amazing. There is no more epidemic in this country. Yeah. And yet, once again, that narrative doesn't get through. It doesn't matter how many times I say it or you say it on many television programmes, we are silenced.
But you talk about coercion, Beverley. One of the biggest advertisers, of course, is the government itself.
The biggest advertiser. So they went from being 20th in 2019 in terms of ad revenue to being the biggest spender in 2020, with a budget of 300 million that they threw at the mainstream media in order to get those messages across, based on nothing. Lies such as, 1 in 3 people are asymptomatic COVID carriers. They've never revealed the science for those sorts of claims. They can't make those sorts of claims. And that's terrifying, because actually asymptomatic transmission is what this whole pack of cards has been built upon. It doesn't work if we don't believe in asymptomatic transmission, because otherwise we're just treating it like a virus. If you've got a cold, you don't go near someone, which is what we should only ever done. And
this fearmongering, I mean, it obviously applies also in schools. So your children, they have to wear masks, and I gather that term's about to start. They were promised it would only be for 3 weeks, and now the whole of this term, apparently they've got to wear masks. Is that what your children are experiencing?
But it is all part of the dehumanization. This is what we need to do in order to create a compliant society where we will have electronic vaccine passports, which the terminology is wrong. I mean, we're talking about a digital ID, and we're talking about a global digital ID whereby everybody from our healthcare provider, which will be private in the fullness of time and probably just around the corner, our banks, our whoever we shop with, everything about us will be on that device. Now, in order to create a generation coming through that will buy into that, we have to tell these children that what they believe in and their individual rights and their autonomy is not relevant. And they are all part of a bigger collective being run by some sort of benevolent dictators, whether that is Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg. So it's a very big picture that we are constantly being taught. We're talking about an infection. We're talking about SARS-CoV-2, which makes COVID-19, but it is not about that. And it has not been about that for a very, very long time. And I despair at the misinformation. My children don't want to go out of the door in masks. I've told their teachers they don't have to wear them if they don't want to. I would give them exceptions to that. However, of course, the children want to, because the children don't want to be different.
Exactly.
And my 12-year-old, who is a good girl, a studious, the kind of the girls at school that do well and they do their homework, they don't get into trouble. She doesn't want to be different, and yet she doesn't want to go to school because she doesn't want to wear a mask. And it's tragic what we've done to that generation. It's unforgivable, in my opinion. We've got to somehow drag ourselves into a free future.
You're so right, Beverley. It actually brings a tear to your eye to hear of children being dehumanized and scared in this way, when they should be energetic and uplifted. It's shocking and terrifying. We could talk forever, Beverley. We've sadly run out of time. We must get you back on, because I fear this story is going to run and run. But thank you so much for being with us, for sharing those thoughts, for being so helpful.
Yeah, thanks.
You're very welcome.
Thanks once again.
Beverley. And I mean, that says it all. It is literally dehumanising what is going on, and you hear that impact on children.
The impact on children has been profound. One of my nieces burst into tears at the thought that she had to wear a mask again. It is not acceptable. And it takes people like Beverley, who has a public profile, but also her job is in jeopardy if you speak out, make no mistake about that. But it takes people like her to stand up and say, we have had enough. This is not acceptable. And that is the way that we can make change.
That is the way we make change. Well, we need more and more high-profile people who've got a platform, who can talk about it, and we will always try and do that on this show. Well, one journalist who has written extensively about the need to curb the government's overzealous grab for power and why we must say no to domestic vaccine passports is Isabel Oakshot. And Isabel is with us now. Hi, thanks for being with us. So you've got some pretty strong views on vaccine passports. But also, some of these cabinet members and ministers, from years gone back. What do you think they're up to? Why are they doing this, and why is it so offensive?
Well, essentially, I agree with the vaccine minister Nadhim Zahawi, who back in February said that the government had no plans to introduce vaccine passports, and that this was not how we do things in Britain. Unfortunately, Nadhim Zahawi, who I rate as a minister, I think he's very effective, and I think he's presided over what I think almost everybody acknowledges has been a very efficient rollout of the vaccine. But he does seem to have had a bit of a volte-face on this. And now the government is very much contemplating whether we may go down this route. And I think that it is a pretty pretty insidious thing, really. The government has floated a number of things, including even the idea that we may have to produce a COVID safe certificate to go and buy a pair of jeans or do our daily shopping. I wondered at the time when they said that whether they were perhaps just sort of trying to prepare us for the worst case scenario, only to introduce something that was slightly less bad, and then we're all incredibly grateful that they didn't go full hard line on this. It does seem to me, though, as if there's a bit of rowing back going on now. There's a very substantial opposition on the Tory backbenches to the idea of mandatory COVID passports. The SNP are being quite potentially helpful to the government on this, but it does seem as if the government may be having a slight case of the cold feet, which is encouraging.
I mean, it's extraordinary. 70 crossbench MPs have actually written a letter saying they don't like the idea of these vaccine passports. Interestingly, out and about when I was campaigning in Dagenham this weekend, people's view was that they didn't really seem very informed about it. And quite frankly, if they could have a beer, they'll do anything to have a beer. And I'm deeply worried that the public are not being told the truth about what's going on.
I think that people are, to some extent, ready to take a pragmatic view on anything that gets us out of lockdown. And that is worrying, as you say, that there's such exhaustion with the measures that we've all had to put up with over the last year, that people will do what it takes right now to get out of that. And, I myself been called up for the vaccine, and, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but nor am I particularly enthusiastic about the prospect of taking the vaccine. I don't really think that I need it. I'm not in a vulnerable group, but I'm going to do it, partly because I think that there's a bit of a social responsibility to do so, and also because I'm afraid that the vaccine passport is an inevitability for international travel. I don't think we can win that battle, because it's not just about winning a battle with our own government, it's about winning a battle with so many other governments all over the world. And look, it's a hard enough fight trying to do things domestically here without taking on the United States and everywhere else we might want to go. But I think that there is definitely a concern that people will they're just weary, and they will kind of just follow the path of least resistance.
But it's then also, isn't it, it's the thin end of the wedge that I think most people don't appreciate about where this could go. What comes next after you put a vaccine passport on it?
Yeah.
It really is the beginning of a sort of a relentless trend, isn't it?
Well, I think so. I mean, Isabel, what's your view about this really being ID cards via the back door? What I'm concerned about is they'll start asking for more data, more medical records. Have you had a flu jab? Why haven't you had a flu jab? Where does this end? Is this really the beginning of national ID cards?
Absolutely. And we're not just talking about adults here. We've already seen a kind of drumbeat towards mandatory MMR vaccines for small children. I mean, way back when my children were at an age where they needed to have that vaccine, I, as a mother, was really genuinely worried about it. I mean, at the time, there was an awful lot of quite difficult information for young new parents to take on board. And I sort of adopted a bit of a precautionary principle and had the jab separately for my children. And that whole debate hasn't really gone away. And up until the time of the pandemic, Matt Hancock was under quite a lot of pressure over the possibility of introducing mandatory MMR vaccination for children to be able to access nurseries, for children to be able to go to school. How far do you take this? What about the HPV vaccine that young teenagers or preteens are now offered? Is that now mandatory? Are they going to have to show certificates at a very young age to access basic services? And I think there's a particularly difficult dimension for the government is a sort of ethnic profiling of this. And we've already seen that there is a remarkably low take-up of the vaccine among certain communities. I think I read a statistic the other day that only a third of those who are invited from certain groups, forgive me, I've just lost my headphone here, who have not taken it up. And then what does that mean then for access to basic services amongst those groups? Are we then going to see a kind of 2 or 3 tier society emerging?
Well, I think you're going to see that there's far more data encoded on them. Also, how do you feel about the trust? Do you trust the government to hold data? They don't have a very good track record in terms of IT rollout, do they?
They have a very poor track record. I think they've learned a lot. They've learned that enormous rollouts carried out by single groups don't work very effectively. And we remain to be convinced. I think most of us, anybody who's followed particularly NHS technology rollouts will be wearily familiar with how wrong these things can go. That said, some aspects of the technology in terms of the vaccine rollout seem to have worked pretty well. I mean, the call out, the messages that people are getting seem to be coming through quite efficiently, and the systems that have been developed to book your appointment. So I don't know, but I do think that the prospect of having the government prying all over our medical data is a pretty sinister one, and it's one that historically people have objected to very vociferously.
And of course, the data actually is very, very valuable. And so the temptation, I guess, will be for the NHS, valuable data is either to sell it to big pharma, but also valuable things tend to get stolen. It then becomes a magnet for hackers to try and steal. I mean, do you have any concerns about that, or do you trust them to keep it secure?
I do think that the sale of data is an absolute no-no, and I think the government more than knows this. I mean, there are many people in Whitehall who still bear the scars of the close near sell-off or prospects of sell-off of data way back in about 2014, 2015. It led to some high-profile resignations. At the time, there was no actual plan to sell off data, but the fear of it and the suggestion that some of those involved in the rollout of projects had links with companies who would be interested in the data was enough to create a real headache for the government. So I think they know they can't go there with that. Apologies for the issues I'm having with this. I've got very small ears and headphones.
One very quick question. You talked about we can't fight the travel passports, but in the matter of domestic vaccine passports, do you think they'll come in, or do you think there'll be a revolt in Parliament?
It's always horrible when you're put on the spot like this. If I had to make a guess now, I don't think they're going to come in, but maybe that's wishful thinking on my part.
Well, there we are. Well, let's hope you're right, but I think there are some serious battles ahead.
So do I.
And I think it's a sort of a negotiation between vaccine passports, the risk of another lockdown, and I think we'll be debating this for months and months and months. Isabel, thank you very much for those thoughts. Absolutely fantastic. Really appreciate it. I know we'll be coming back to this again and again, but thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, when put on the spot, Isabel has said no, she doesn't think they'll come in. But I think there's a huge debate that's going to go on and on for months about variants.
Yes.
And the risk of variants versus vaccine. Whenever we get good news, all of a sudden you get bad variant news. You get chat about India. And this may be the excuse.
But Isabella is making the right point, which is actually, I think this is about diversion and confusing the public and giving them different data. And actually, talking to people, they've said, well, it doesn't matter, I will go along with this because it's temporary. Make no mistake, this is not temporary. This is permanent. Once this comes in, that is what we are going to have.
And the reason you know that it's permanent, is not temporary, is because, of course, vaccines have an expiry date. We don't yet know how long that is. Different vaccines, presumably, will have different expiry dates. And so you'll have to have boosters. You'll have to have new vaccines that adapt to the new variants. This is all part of, and of course they'll then say, well, we need to know where you're at, and this is all part of the control.
But suddenly you're holding a handheld computer with all your medical data on it. And it isn't a far stretch to say, actually, when you go to a restaurant, you check in, it knows what you've eaten, it knows how many calories. This links back into your medical records, your risk of obesity, heart disease. There's
a wonderful article by the brilliant MP, who's a fantastic orator, Charles Walker, and he wrote in the Telegraph, that all of a sudden you'll go into your restaurant or to Burger King, you'll click on wanting a double burger, and then say, you can't have that. You only have a salad because you've had too many calories this week. I mean, this is where Big Brother takes it.
So I thought we lived in a free democracy. Well, apparently we don't anymore. We live in a state-controlled environment, and I'm deeply worried. And because people are so fed up, as Isabel said, so fed up, and will do anything to get out of this mess, the question is, how far does this really go? And the really key message here is we need to get that message out to people to say no to vaccine passports. It's absolutely outrageous. And the one thing you can do do as a voter
Yeah.
is vote,
Yeah.
and vote against vaccine passports.
Absolutely. So against vaccine passports, and of course against any more national lockdowns. I mean,
Exactly.
you know, we haven't talked about, it's another whole subject, the collateral damage from more national lockdowns. People are tired, people are exhausted. We've had two great guests, Beverley Turner, Isabel Oakshot, very strong views. You know, these are the powerful voices that hopefully will convince the nation.
Yeah, and I'm just hoping that more and more people are going to start speaking out as we have done. And it does take guts to do that. And I want to see more people in the public eye actually come out and say, we don't like the direction of travel.
No, it does take guts. We get a lot of grief for it, but it's got to be done. Well, we could go on for much longer, but that's we're running out of time, David. Thank you so much for those thoughts. Such an important topic. Well, that's all we've got time for this week on the Vaccine Passport Special. Many thanks to my guests, Beverley Turner, Isabel Oakshot, and thank you, David, as always, the $1 million man.
I thought you'd forgotten.
I wouldn't forget. So join us next week. Plenty more politics, thoughts, views, honest and sometimes difficult opinions. Until then, goodbye.